What the hell is up, losers? Today I wanted to talk about why kids don't like rock music anymore. Because over the last decade, rock has taken a huge backseat. Its decline began about when pop punk and metal took off. Then they had one last hurrah, rallying around emo and metal bands of the late 2010s. But what caused rock to become cringe, lame, parental music? Most people under 25 are more into rap and trap and all the other variations of that. Even this generation of alternative punk kids aren't really listening to rebellious punk of a few decades ago. And who can blame them? Rock in the 70s was considered dangerous, and parents thought it was satanic. And bands like AC/DC and Black Sabbath and Pink Floyd and the Rolling Stones all had an image of being dangerous people. They were into drugs, promiscuity, and the lyrics had a very dark but subtle subject matter, much like today's rap music is, but it's not subtle. Now, when you fast forward to the 80s and you see thrash starting to take off, heavy bands like Metallica, Motorhead, Slayer, and then the punk bands like The Exploited were starting to take rock music to brand new highs and new extremes. Not to mention the 80s saw a new branch gaining traction, goth rock. And even though goth rock never really became a popular genre, the style of dress that it influenced is still very much thriving and active today. Then when we arrive in the 90s and you have grunge bands like Nirvana and Alice in Chains, industrial acts like Marilyn Manson and Nine Inch Nails, all of these bands had huge followings of young people and set the trends for the early part of the decade. But then you get to the latter half of the decade, bands like Korn, Slipknot, and other nu metal performers changed everything up once again and had a profound impact on culture at large. Music influences culture, kids need icons. Who else are they going to identify with? Once the 2000s hit, though, a lot of mainstream rock bands were the same ones from the nu metal and grunge era, and I think this is when rock really started to fall off. Because despite the fact bands like My Chemical Romance were achieving mainstream success, you weren't really hearing them on rock radio. I grew up around this time period, and I don't remember ever really hearing any of the bands that I liked on the radio at the time. Everything was legacy bands from the early 2000s who weren't hip, weren't cool, and who weren't what kids were into. So even though rock was still pretty popular then, the mainstream overlords basically let it die because they didn't want to play and promote the music that young people were actually listening to. And then shortly after that period ended, basically nothing new came to take its place. Instead, the younger generations moved on, found themselves identifying more with rap acts like Lil Peep, Suicide Boys, and Ghostman, and City Morgue, and all these alt-rap people. But what did these alternative / trap metal / whatever artists have that rock artists were no longer bringing to the table? Well, I'll tell you. In my opinion, it was a few things. First being that rock bands weren't bringing anything new to the table. There are no new sounds coming out of rock. Everything has been made before. People are just rehashing old ideas over and over and over again. There's nothing exciting about hearing the same songs played again and again. In fact, after a while, you start to resent them because you're so sick of hearing it. The second reason is that the rock bands just aren't that cool. Every decade of music in the past had their icons, their cool guys, the people kids wanted to idolize and look up to, and that's not just important for a scene to thrive, it's literally required. Kids can't identify with 50-year-old rock stars who peaked 30 to 50 years ago and still dress like it's 1985. The third reason, and one of the most important in my opinion, is that we've seen a huge decline in the popularity of what I like to call the danger factor. Parents of the last 50 years and respectable society as a whole feared the influence these hard-living rock stars would have on their kids, and the best way to make kids want to do something is to have parents and society oppose it. Parents today aren't scared of any rock musicians because most of the artists were around when today's parents were kids. It's not new, it's not frightening, it's not shocking. It's not anything. It's just boring. Like, even the modern rock bands, they're all like hipsters wearing cowboy hats and drinking frappe lattes and fucking shit like that. That's not fun. That's not scary. That's boring. It's cringe and it's lame. But when you look at artists like the Suicide Boys or Lil Peep or even Juice WRLD, it's something fresh and unknown that a lot of people from the parent generation don't understand. Not to mention, they fear the influence they'll have on the kids because of the overdoses in all sorts of horrible influences that drugs play on the music. Which, let's be honest, rock had the same drug issues. But the key difference, in my opinion, is that most of the bands were never blatantly talking about drug use. They always used innuendos and analogies and clever wordplay instead of outright saying it like modern artists do. So when you put all that together, you have a recipe for stagnation, which is exactly what's happened. It got boring, stale, old, and just overall predictable and boring. I said boring twice. That's okay. Another thing that I think has played a big role in rock's decline is that it's been pushed to the absolute extremes, which rap has not done yet. In rock, they went as extreme as possible with death metal, black metal, gore grind, and all the other plethora of metal subgenres. Once you have bands tuned to drop F and pig squealing, what else is there to do? That hasn't happened yet with rap. We're still exploring the limits of how extreme the genre can be pushed before we've gone too far. And they're getting close now. Kim Dracula, they are pushing it pretty far. They're combining like the pig squeal and the gutturals and the screaming black metal type vocals with rap. And it will eventually happen more and more with rap too. Nothing is permanent, especially when it comes to trends. All things have to come to an end eventually, and I'm sure there will be a ton of new